Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 515. Wait, what's the date? This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by its listeners. Many thanks and much gratefulness to all of the listeners who have gone over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledged their support to the show. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I apologize to those who are listening in real time because it's only taken 15 years for me to finish Treasure Island. Let me give you a brief rundown of what's been happening in the meantime. We'll start with the fun part. Thing 2, and I believe I mentioned this previously, was cast as Conrad in Much Ado About Nothing. Right before the show was set to open, Andrew had to start traveling again, which means I had to start getting home much earlier, which means things got very complicated because I have a half-hour drive to a train and then an hour drive on a train and then a 15-minute walk to the office and then doing that in reverse. So I wasn't getting much sleep, which means recording on the weekends was really hard because normally I get up crazy early and record before the house starts to wake and yeah, I kind of couldn't do that anymore. So the fun part though was the show because it was fun. The kids actually did a really good job with Much Ado, which is not an easy play. I mean, for one thing, as we know, it's comedy. And Shakespearean comedies are tricky because there's lots of dirty jokes. And it's really hard to get the funny across, usually. But Much Ado is pretty obvious in most of its humor. And I thought they did a marvelous job of cutting the play down as well. And it was not the straight up Kenneth Branagh version by a long shot, nor was it straight up the Joss Whedon cutting. They did their own specific cuts and it really worked. How do I know this? Because Aaron Ziegler and Shannon came and saw the show, which I cannot tell you how thrilled, well, first terrified, but then after that thrilled. Thing 2 was to have such an illustrious Shakespearean expert in the house. We didn't have perfect seats for being able to hear him. They do it thrust, and the kids just are no longer trained to project their voices, which is a shame because they really were very good. I'll see if I can get a couple of good pictures to post. It was really funny seeing my goofy son be the bad guy because he shows up scowling. They did the whole thing where Messina was kind of UCLA, so it's a college thing. So instead of coming back from a war, they're coming back from a game, which actually worked pretty well. I mean, suspension of disbelief and all that, but it was not a completely stupid way to do it. And by that, what I mean is it wasn't the way I would have done it, which would have been completely lame. It really worked well. But there is my son in UCLA colors with a hoodie and his hat on backwards, looking like he walked out of a fraternity house 10 minutes earlier, and I was stupefied because he just doesn't look like that normally. He did a great job. It was a lot of fun. So that was the other thing that was happening was I was spending a lot of time with him when, I could have ditched him and come downstairs to record, and so I didn't, is the thing. So quality time with the boy, that was a lot of fun. Aaron Ziegler and Shannon, we went out to dinner beforehand without the actor in the family. And then after the show, we went out and got dessert. So Thing 2 had a little bit of quality time with the Ziegler. And that was great as well. And we tried to calculate how long we've actually known each other. And it went from hearing about each other through Julie Davis, Forgotten Classics podcast, and Happy Catholic blog and books. And then we spoke to each other, I think on Skype several times before we ever even got around to the idea, the concept of doing anything together. We've known each other a really long time. because we've been doing this for a really long time. So it was really neat. And it's, neat to share podcast listeners with each other too, because there are names that cross over, and it makes the world smaller and happier. And right now that seems like a really awesome thing. So all hail the Ziegler is what I'm saying. The other thing that's been happening is work. Work was a lot of work. They have been gradually removing all of the extra crazy that I'd been doing and had to do because there was nobody else there to do it. They've been doing a really good job of peeling back the layers so that I just have my regular job to do. And that's been awesome. But the last really major time suck that kicked in was our final move. I know I started the year moving to Philadelphia from New Jersey, which was hard. We were only moving up 7 floors. It really shouldn't be that difficult. But, disruption, it's like moving next door to your apartment, like from one apartment to another one next door, or from one townhouse to another townhouse next door. It doesn't sound like it's going to be that big a deal, but then you do it and you still have to put stuff in boxes. So that was also a huge time suck because it was either going to be during work hours or after or before work hours that you wind up doing the packing and rearranging and figuring stuff out and getting together and making sure that all the bases are covered and that the scientists are going to be able to hit the ground running in their labs once they get up there. And thank God this time I didn't have to do a whole lot of that part. Mostly, I just had to get my own stuff packed and get my assistant, get upstairs. Still wound up being a lot. So we're moved. Space is beautiful. Philly's been good to us. Aaron, thing one, has come home for his winter break after his 3rd semester at the University of the Arts. I don't know if you follow either of the boys on Instagram, but if you do, you will see the things that they're working on. And I am going to force them to start posting more because they really are doing some excellent work. And in fact, the button, the very special holiday-themed button for this episode was drawn by Thing 2. So on top of all of that, when I wasn't either Inktoberring or NaNoWriMoing on the train in the morning and on the train on the way home, I watched videos because I was so brain dead. And then I thought, well, maybe I should do something not so brain dead. Maybe I should learn something. And somehow, I really do not remember how, I wound up stumbling on a set of videos about ADD, ADHD, adult ADD, and executive functioning. And I am linking out to 2 videos. One is kind of standalone. I didn't watch anything else by this guy, but 46 minutes into this talk, and really it is the kind of talk that you just play in the background and kind of vaguely keep your ear open for little nuggets that drop out and you go, oh, my kids would probably benefit from that. Or, oh, my students should really know that that's a thing. In between all of that, I don't even remember what the thing was, but at 46 minutes, I remember my brain exploded and went, oh my gosh, well, that changes everything. And I guess it changed it so completely that I don't even remember anymore. I've just adopted it as my own way of living. So that's the first video. The second video is a guy named Russell Barkley, who many of you, I'm sure, have already heard of. I'm just late to the party because some of his videos are 11 years old. Some of them are 5 years old. Some of them are from last week. This is a neurobiologist. So he is not approaching ADD or ADHD or executive functioning from a position of a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a counselor or a behavioral therapist, although he does talk often and importantly about cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and also BT, just behavioral therapy. What he does do an amazing job of, and you need to know going in that he has been classified as being low on the spectrum, but on the ADD scale himself, not the spectrum that includes Asperger's and autism, but I'm talking about ADD and ADHD and executive functioning issues all being on a spectrum, because I think they are. And I think if you have had children who exhibited something that looked like ADHD, but they're not so hyperactive. But maybe you've tried medication and found that, yes, actually, giving my child a stimulant calms them down and makes it possible for them to focus. That's weird. This is the guy who's going to explain what's going on inside their brain, or inside my brain, or inside any brain that has these kinds of issues. So that was the second time my brain exploded, was just starting to recognize the chemistry involved. And, I've from time to time paid a lot of attention to brain stuff. I think neurochemistry and neurobiology are just fascinating, as are psychology and sociology and all of the, well, I guess just ologies in general. Gee, that doesn't sound ADD at all, Heather. He's good. He's good. He's useful. If you or someone you know is either dealing with thinking, gosh, I wonder why I can't keep track of time. I wonder why I can't keep track of paper. I wonder why I can spend 8 hours without moving or go to the bathroom playing SimCity, Heather says, talking about herself, but get kind of fidgety if I have to sit at a desk and read a book. I read, but it's rarely at a desk. So there's all sorts of actual, useful, explanatory information in these 2 videos. They are linked to from the podcast show notes. I am telling you, however, first video is the one-off. Second video, Russell Barkley. He is, he's all over YouTube. Some people have taken his long, and I mean long, hours long videos and chopped them up by topic. So you get 5 minutes on executive functioning, or 7 minutes on the brain chemistry, or 15 minutes on why ADD is really a bad name for this disorder, but not going to change anytime soon because laws in Canada and the United States have been written specifically for ADD, ADHD. And as a consequence, you would totally disenfranchise all these people who are being covered under Americans with Disabilities Acts and whatever the act is in Canada that's protecting people. So you can find these short snippets, or you can find his entire lectures. And again, some of them are from 11 years ago. Some of them are from last week. Some of them are interviews. You just pop his name into your YouTube search engine and you could watch for days and not be bored. He's funny too, which I like. So yeah, neurobiochemistry and Shakespeare have been taking up my life. You're not going to come across that very often, are you? No. But that's what you come to Craftlit for, right? Complete non sequiturs that somehow seem to dovetail together at the end. I have no idea how I'm going to bring it back to neurological biochemistry and Shakespeare, but we'll see if I can pull this off. If I do, it'll be the perfect end to the book. All right, book, Treasure Island, last 3 chapters. These are 3 very short chapters. They're not particularly long. And they are important. I mean, obviously, Heather, they're important. They're the end of the book. But they're important, too, because when last we left our band of merry pirates setting out to go find their treasure, instead they wound up finding a skeleton, a body, what had been a body, what is now a skeleton, laid out with its arms together like it's on a diving board and going to dive into water, but its arms straight out pointing like a compass pointer, which is kind of creepy, and its feet pointing the other way. So it's ramrod straight, not a natural way to die and become a skeleton. So they're all a little freaked out. We know that we are going to have to stay with the pirates at least for a little while longer because they have to get the treasure, right? They have to get there. It's called Bloody Treasure Island. If we don't get to the treasure on the island, it'll be a bad truth in advertising problem. And probably the book wouldn't have been very popular. And since it is, at heart, it claims to be a kid's adventure tale, we know that's going to have to happen. It also means we're going to have to get the rest of the band back together too, because we have some unanswered questions. We know how Livesey responded to Jim running off and then having his adventure with the coracle and the Hispaniola. We don't know how Trelawney or Smollett or any of the other guys who are still alive, we hope, maybe, but people are getting sick from malaria. We have to get them all back together. Jim has to get back with them, right? We know he has to get back safely, whether it's with the pirates, which seems kind of unlikely, or with Livesey and the Squire. We know he has to get back because he told us at the beginning of the book that he was telling us this story about this thing that happened when he was a young man. So we already know he gets out safe. And in the hands of a master like Stevenson, that does nothing to diminish the air of suspense that surrounds this part of the novel. So he's just that good. So we've got to get the band back together. We got to get him back home. And you have to know a couple of things. I am linking out to a page on, and this is just one of those rabbit holes, on a skylark. Not because there's an ode to a skylark in this book. That's somewhere else. No, instead, there is a term that is used called skylarking. Hey, cut out that skylarking, kids. They're messing around. They're skylarking. Skylarks turn out to be really interesting birds. And I have no idea if what I've linked out to is accurate, but it's 21 facts on skylarks. They do lots of things, but I think the most important ones are they have a very noticeable, beautiful, and low register song. So there are mockingbirds who have very high-pitched songs that are also noticeable and kind of classic. Skylarks are the other ones. Skylarks do something else, though. They play a lot in the air. And one of the ways that they play is they fly really high. According to this page, all the other birds, all the loser birds, fly about 200 meters high. And they may fly higher, but they will not sing at any higher altitude. Skylarks, they claim, will sing and fly up to 600 meters, which is really high. So they're daredevil singing things that just like to swoop around and have a good time. If what I have read is absolutely inaccurate, please let us know and I will somehow get the information out or post a comment on the Facebook Craftlit group or over in Ravelry if you're on Ravelry. But share your genius if I have screwed up on mine. I actually had a really hard time finding even this much. But now I want to go find some skylarks and just watch them for a while because they sound really cool. So skylarking is a word you will hear used once, but now you know what it means. I wanted to, because I got really frustrated, I couldn't remember this when I got to the very, very, very end of the book. There's an allusion to something that happened earlier, and I am going to read you a chunk of text that will be useful later. A lot of stuff is packed into it, and I'm not going to give you any hints as to which part of this is the part that's going to matter. So you just have to pay attention to all of it. This is from the first conversation that young Jim Hawkins had with Ben Gunn on the island. And Ben Gunn is, as you might recall, kind of nervous at meeting and talking to any human, but certainly a stranger. He realizes that this kid came off a boat, came off a ship, and of course, ships mean pirates, and pirates mean scary people who left him alone to die. So he says, "If you was sent by Long John," he said, "I'm as good as pork, and I know it. But where was you, do you suppose?" I had made up my mind in a moment, and by way of answer told him that the whole story of our voyage and the predicament in which we found ourselves. He heard me with the keenest interest, and when I had done, he patted me on the head. "You're a good lad, Jim," he said, "and you're all in a clove hitch, ain't you? Well, you just put your trust in Ben Gunn. Ben Gunn's the man to do it. Would you think it likely now that your squire would prove a liberal-minded one in case of help, him being in a clove hitch, as you remark?" Okay, I have to break in for a moment because this is hilarious. He's the one who said that Jim is in a clove hitch, and now he's saying that the squire's in a clove hitch too, and that Jim is the one who came up with and said that because Ben Gunn has been having a conversation with himself for a really long time now, 3 years, and literally putting words into the mouth of his imaginary speaking companions. So he continues to do that now that Jim's there. Jim says, I told him the squire was the most liberal of men. Aye, but do you see, returned Ben Gunn, I didn't mean giving me a gate to keep and a suit of livery clothes and such. That's not my mark, Jim. What I mean is, would he be likely to come down to the tune, say, £1,000 out of the money that's as good as a man's own already? I am sure he would, said I, as it was all hands were to share. And a passage home, he added with a look of great shrewdness. Why, I cried, the squire's a gentleman. And besides, if we got rid of the others, we should want you to help with the vessel home. Ah, said he, so you would. And he seemed very much relieved. There's part of that will come back to you at the very, very, very end of the book. Probation does not mean what we tend to think it means when it is used in Treasure Island. Probation in this case means a close examination of something. So like on second look or on further probation, we could see blah, blah, blah. A pig nut. Boy, did I have a hard time with this. Pig nuts apparently are either hickory nuts, a kind of almondish tasting peanut, a ground nut, or very hard lumps of something stone-ish, compacted somethingness that shows up in dirt. I have no idea. I thought it was going to have something to do with pig iron, but no, I couldn't find anything on it. Once again, if you know something, share. Teetotum. A teetotum, also not what I thought it was going to be. A teetotum is a small spinning top. If you think dreidel, you will have the right idea because each side has a different letter on it and you can put bets on, sounds familiar, huh? Bets on the letters, and depending on how the top falls down, whichever number is up or whichever letter is up, the person who bet on that gets to win. So that is a teetotum. And that is literally everything I got for you. Now we get to listen to the final 3 chapters of Treasure Island. Here we go.
Chapter 32. The Treasure Hunt, the Voice Among the Trees. Partly from the damping influence of this alarm, partly to rest Silver and the sick folk, the whole party sat down as soon as they had gained the brow of the ascent. The plateau being somewhat tilted toward the west, this spot on which we had paused commanded a wide prospect on either hand. Before us, over the tree-tops, we held the cape of the woods fringed with surf. Behind, we not only looked down upon the anchorage and Skeleton Island, but saw, clear across the spit and the eastern lowlands, a great field of open sea upon the east. Sheer above us rose the spyglass, here dotted with single pines, there black with precipices. There was no sound but that of the distant breakers mounting from all around and the chirp of countless insects in the brush. Not a man, not a sail on the sea. The very largeness of the view increased the sense of solitude. Silver, as he sat, took certain bearings with his compass. "There are 3 tall trees," said he, "about in the right line from Skeleton Island. Spyglass shoulder. I take it means that lower point there. It's child's play to find the stuff now. I've half a mind to dine first." "I don't feel sharp," growled Morgan. "Thinking of Flint, I think it were, has done me." "Well, my son, you praise your stars he's dead," said Silver. "He was a ugly devil," cried a third pirate with a shudder. "That blue in the face, too." "That was how the rum took him," added Merry. "Blue? Well, I reckon he was blue. That's a true word." Ever since they had found the skeleton and got upon this train of thought, they had spoken lower and lower, and they had almost got to whispering by now, so that the sound of their talk hardly interrupted the silence of the wood. All of a sudden, out of the middle of the trees in front of us, a thin, high, trembling voice struck up the well-known air and words. 50 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. I never have seen men more dreadfully affected than the pirates. The colour went from their 6 faces like enchantment. Some leapt to their feet, some clawed hold of others. Morgan grovelled on the ground. "It's Flint Pie!" cried Mary. The song had stopped as suddenly as it began, broken off, you would have said, in the middle of a note, as though someone had laid his hand upon the singer's mouth. Coming so far through the clear and sunny atmosphere among the green tree-tops, I thought it had sounded airily and sweetly, and the effect on my companions was the stranger. "Come," said Silver, struggling with his ashen lips to get the word out. "That won't do. Stand by to go about. This is a rum start, and I can't name the voice, but it's someone skylarking. Someone that's flesh and blood, and you may lay to that." His courage had come back as he spoke, and some of the colour to his face along with it. Already the others had begun to lend an ear to this encouragement, and were coming a little to themselves, when the same voice broke out again, not this time singing, but in a faint, distant hail that echoed yet fainter among the clefts of the spyglass. "Darby McGraw," it wailed, for that is the word that best describes the sound. "Darby McGraw, Darby McGraw." Again and again and again, and then rising a little higher, and with an oath that I leave out. "Fetch off the rum, Darby." The buccaneers remained rooted to the ground, their eyes starting from their heads. Long after the voice had died away, they still stared in silence, dreadfully before them. "That fixes it," gasped one. "Let's go." "They was his last words," moaned Morgan. "His last words above board." Dick had his Bible out and was praying volubly. He had been well brought up, had Dick, before he had come to sea and fell among bad companions. Still, Silver was unconquered. I could hear his teeth rattle in his head, but he had not surrendered. "Nobody in this here island ever heard of Darby," he muttered. "Not one but us that's here." And then, making a great effort, "Shipmates," he cried, "I'm here to get that stuff, and I'll not be beat by man nor devil. I never was feared of Flint in his life, and by the powers I'll face him dead. There's £700,000 not a quarter of a mile from here. When did ever a gentleman of fortune show his stern to that much dollars for a boozy old seaman with a blue mug, and him dead too?" But there was no sign of reawakening courage in his followers, rather, indeed, of growing terror at the irreverence of his words. "Belay there, John," said Mary. "Don't you cross a spirit." And the rest were all too terrified to reply. They would have run away severally had they dared, but fear kept them together, and kept them close to John, as if his daring helped them. He, on his part, had pretty well fought his weakness down. "Spirit? Well, maybe," he said, "but there's one thing not clear to me. There was an echo. Now, no man ever seen a spirit with a shadow. Well then, what's he doing with an echo to him, I should like to know? That ain't in nature, surely." This argument seemed weak enough to me, but you can never tell what will affect the superstitious, and, to my worry, George Merry was greatly relieved. "Well, that's so," he said. "You've head upon your shoulders, John, and no mistake. 'Bout shipmates, this here crew is on a wrong tack, I do believe, and you come to think on it, it was like Flint's voice, I grant you, but not just so clear away like it after all. It was like somebody else's voice now. It was like By the powers, Ben Gunn!" roared Silver. "Aye, and so it were," cried Morgan, springing on his knees. "Ben Gunn it were. "It don't make much odds, do it now?" asked Dick. "Ben Gunn's not here in the body any more of Flint." But the older hands greeted this remark with scorn. "Why, nobody minds Ben Gunn," cried Mary. "Dead or alive, nobody minds him." It was extraordinary how their spirits had returned, and how the natural colour had revived in their faces. Soon they were chatting together, with intervals of listening, and not long after, hearing no further sound, they shouldered the tools and set forth again, Mary walking first with Silver's compass to keep them on the right line with Skeleton Island. He had said the truth. Dead or alive, nobody minded Ben Gunn. Dick alone still held his Bible, and looked around him as he went with fearful glances, but he found no sympathy, and Silver even joked him on his precautions. "I told you," said he, "I told you you had spoiled your Bible. If it ain't no good to swear by, what do you suppose a spirit will give for it? Not that." And he snapped his big fingers, halting a moment on his crutch. But Dick was not to be comforted. Indeed, it was soon plain to me that the lad was falling sick, hastened by heat, exhaustion, and the shock of his alarm. The fever predicted by Dr. Livesey was evidently growing swiftly higher. It was fine open walking here upon the summit. Our way lay a little downhill, for, as I have said, the plateau tilted toward the west. The pines, great and small, grew wide apart, and even between the clumps of nutmeg and azalea, wide open spaces baked in the hot sunshine. Striking as we did pretty near northwest across the island, we drew, on the one hand, even nearer under the shoulders of the spyglass, and, on the other, looked even wider over that western bay where I had once tossed and trembled in the coracle. The first of the tall trees was reached, and by the bearing proved the wrong one. So with the second, and the third rose nearly 200 feet into the air above a clump of underwood, a giant of a vegetable, with a red column as big as a cottage, and a wide shadow around in which a company could have manoeuvred. It was conspicuous far to sea, both on the east and west, and might have been entered as a sailing mark upon the chart. But it was not its size that now impressed my companions. It was the knowledge that £700,000 in gold lay somewhere buried below its spreading shadow. The thought of the money, as they drew nearer, swallowed up their previous terrors. Their eyes burned in their heads, their feet grew speedier and lighter, their whole soul was bound up in that fortune, that whole lifetime of extravagance and pleasure that lay awaiting there for each of them. Silver hobbled, grunting, on his crutch. His nostrils stood out and quivered. He cursed like a madman when the flies settled on his hot and shiny countenance. He plucked furiously at the line that held me to him, and from time to time turned his eyes upon me with a deadly look. Certainly he took no pains to hide his thoughts, and certainly I read them like print. In the immediate nearness of the gold all else had been forgotten. His promise and the doctor's warning were both things of the past, and I could not doubt that he hoped to seize upon the treasure, find and board the Hispaniola under cover of night, cut every honest throat about that island, and sail away as he had first intended, laden with crimes and riches. Shaken as I was with these alarms, it was hard for me to keep up with the rapid race of the treasure hunters. Now and again I stumbled, and it was then that Silver plucked so roughly at the rope and launched at me his murderous glances. Dick, who had dropped behind us and now brought up the rear, was babbling to himself both prayers and curses as his fever kept rising. This also added to my wretchedness, and, to crown all, I was haunted by the thought of the tragedy that had once been acted on that plateau, when that ungodly buccaneer with the blue face, he who had died at Savannah singing and shouting for drink, had there with his own hand cut down his 6 accomplices. This grove that was now so peaceful must have rung with cries, I thought, and even with the thought I could believe I heard it ringing still. We were now at the margin of the thicket. "Huzzah, mates, all together!" shouted Merry, and the foremost broke into a run. And suddenly, not 10 yards farther, we beheld them stop. A low cry arose. Silver doubled his pace, digging away with the foot of his crutch like one possessed, and the next moment he and I had come also to a dead halt. Before us was a great excavation, not very recent, for the sides had fallen in and grass had sprouted on the bottom. In this were the shaft of a pick broken in two, and the boards of several packing cases strewn around. On one of these boards I saw branded with a hot iron the name Walrus, the name of Flint's ship. All was clear to probation. The cash had been found and rifled. The £700,000 were gone. End of Chapter 32. Chapter 33. The Fall of a Chieftain. There never was such an overturn in this world. All of these 6 men was as through as he had been struck, but with Silver the blow passed almost instantly. Every thought of his soul had been set full stretch like a racer on that money. Well, he was brought up in a single second dead, and he kept his head, found his temper, and changed his plan before the others had had time to realize the disappointment. "Jim," he whispered, "take that and stand by for trouble." And he passed me a double-barrelled pistol. At the same time he began quietly moving northward, and in a few steps had put the hollow between us 2 and the other 5. Then he looked at me and nodded, as much as to say, "Here is a narrow corner," as indeed I thought it was. His looks were now quite friendly, and I was so revolted at these constant changes that I could not forbear whispering, "So you've changed sides again." There was no time left for him to answer in. The buccaneers, with oaths and cries, began to leap one after another into the pit, and to dig with their fingers, throwing the boards aside as they did so. Morgan found a piece of gold. He held it up with a perfect spout of oaths. It was a 2-guinea piece, and it went from hand to hand among them for a quarter of a minute. "2 guineas?" roared Merry, shaking it at Silver. "That's your £700,000, is it? You're the man for bargains, ain't you? You're him that never bungled nothing, you wooden-headed lubber." "Dig away, boys," said Silver with the coolest insolence. "You'll find some pig nuts, I shouldn't wonder." "Pig nuts!" repeated Merry in a scream. "Mates, do you hear that? I tell you now, that man there knew it all along. Look in the face of him and you'll see it wrote there." "Ah, Merry," remarked Silver, "standing for a cutting again. You're a pushing lad, to be sure." But this time every one was entirely in Merry's favour. They began to scramble out of the excavation, darting furious glances behind them. One thing I observed, which looked well for us: they all got out upon the opposite side from Silver. Well, there we stood, 2 on one side, 5 on the other, the pit between us, and nobody screwed up high enough to offer the first blow. Silver never moved. He watched them very upright on his crutch, and looked as cool as ever I saw him. He was brave and no mistake. At last Merry seemed to think a speech might help matters. "Mates," said he, "there's 2 of them alone here. One's the old cripple that brought us all here and blundered us down to this. The other's that cub that I mean to have the heart of. Now, mates." He was raising his arm and his voice, and plainly meant to lead a charge. But just then, crack, 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 3 musket shots flashed out of the thicket. Merry tumbled head foremost into the excavation. The man with the bandage spun round like a teetotum, and fell all his length upon his side, where he lay dead but still twitching, and the other three turned and ran for it with all their might. Before you could wink, Long John fired 2 barrels of a pistol into the struggling Merry, and as the man rolled up his eyes at him in the last agony, "George," said he, "I reckon I settled you." In the same moment the Doctor, Gray, and Ben Gunn joined us with smoking muskets from among the nutmeg trees. "Forward!" cried the Doctor. "Double quick, my lads. We must head 'em off the boats." And we set off at a great pace, sometimes plunging through the bushes to the chest. I tell you, but Silver was anxious to keep up with us. The work that man went through, leaping on his crutch till the muscles of his chest were fit to burst, was work no sound man ever equalled, and so thinks the Doctor. As it was, he was already 30 yards behind us, and on the verge of strangling when we reached the brow of the slope. "Doctor!" he hailed. "See there! No hurry!" Sure enough, there was no hurry. In a more open part of the plateau we could see the 3 survivors still running in the same direction as they had started, right for Middenmast Hill. We were already between them and the boats, and so we 4 sat down to breathe, while Long John, mopping his face, came slowly up with us. "Thank ye kindly, Doctor," says he. "You came in about the nick, I guess, for me and Hawkins. And so it's you, Ben Gunn," he added. "Well, you're a nice one, to be sure." "I'm Ben Gunn, I am," replied the Maroon, wriggling like an eel in his embarrassment. "And," he added after a long pause, "how do, Mr. Silver? Pretty well, I thank ye, says you." "Ben, Ben," murmured Silver, "to think as you've done me." The Doctor sent back Gray for one of the pickaxes deserted in their flight by the mutineers, and then, as we proceeded leisurely downhill to where the boats were lying, related in a few words what had taken place. It was a story that profoundly interested Silver, and Ben Gunn, the half-idiot Maroon, was the hero from beginning to end. Ben, in his long, lonely wanderings about the island, had found the skeleton. It was he that had rifled it. He had found the treasure. He had dug it up. It was the haft of his pickaxe that lay broken in the excavation. He had carried it on his back in many weary journeys from the foot of the tall pine to a cave he had on the 2-pointed hill at the northeast angle of the island, and there it had lain stored in safety since 2 months before the arrival of the Hispaniola. When the Doctor had wormed the secret from him on the afternoon of the attack, and when next morning he saw the anchorage deserted, he had gone to Silver, given him the chart, which was now useless, given him the stores, for Ben Gunn's cave was well supplied with goat's meat salted by himself, given anything and everything to get a chance of moving in safety from the stockade to the 2-pointed hill, there to be clear of malaria and keep a guard upon the money. "As for you, Jim," he said, "it went against my heart, but I did what I thought best for those who had stood by their duty, and if you were not one of these, whose fault was it?" That morning, finding that I was to be involved in the horrid disappointment he had prepared for the mutineers, he had run all the way to the cave, and, leaving Squire to guard the captain, had taken Gray and the Maroon and started, making the diagonal across the island, to be at hand beside the pine. Soon, however, he saw that our party had the start of him, and Ben Gunn, being fleet of foot, had been dispatched in front to do his best alone. Then it had occurred to him to work upon the superstitions of his former shipmates, and he was so far successful that Gray and the Doctor had come up and were already ambushed before the arrival of the treasure hunters. "Arr," said Silver, "it was fortunate for me that I had Hawkins here. You would have let old Long John be cut to bits, and never a thought, Doctor." "Not a thought," replied Dr. Livesey cheerily, and by this time we had reached the gigs. The Doctor, with the pickaxe, demolished one of them. Then we all got aboard the other and set out to go round by the sea for North Inlet. This was a run of 8 or 9 miles. Silver, though he was almost killed already with fatigue, was set to an oar like the rest of us, and we were soon skimming swiftly over a smooth sea. Soon we passed out of the straits and doubled the southeast corner of the island, round which 4 days ago we had towed the Hispaniola. As we passed the two-pointed hill we could see the black mouth of Ben Gunn's cave and a figure standing by it, leaning on a musket. It was the squire, and we waved a handkerchief and gave him 3 cheers, in which the voice of Silver joined as heartily as any. 3 miles farther, just inside the mouth of North Inlet, what should we meet but the Hispaniola cruising by herself? The last flood had lifted her, and had there been much wind or a strong tide current, as in the southern anchorage, we should never have found her more, or found her stranded beyond help. As it was, there was little amiss beyond the wreck of the mainsail. Another anchor was got ready and dropped in 1.5 fathoms of water. We all pulled round to Rum Cove, the nearest point for Ben Gunn's treasure house. Then Gray, single-handed, returned with the gig to the Hispaniola, where he was to pass the night on guard. A gentle slope ran up from the beach to the entrance of the cave. At the top the squire met us. To me he was cordial and kind, saying nothing of my escapade, either in the way of blame or praise. At Silver's polite salute he somewhat flushed. "John Silver," he said, "you're a prodigious villain and impostor, a monstrous impostor, sir. I am told I am not to prosecute you. Well, then, I will not. But the dead men, sir, hang about your neck like millstones." "Thank you kindly, sir," replied Long John, again saluting. "How dare you thank me?" cried the squire. "It is a gross dereliction of my duty. Stand back." And thereupon we all entered the cave. It was a large, airy place, with a little spring and a pool of clear water, overhung with ferns. The floor was sand. Before a big fire lay Captain Smollett, and in a far corner, only duskily flitted over by the blaze, I beheld great heaps of coin and quadrilaterals built of bars of gold. That was Flint's treasure that we had come so far to seek, and that had cost already the lives of 17 men from the Hispaniola. How many it had cost in the amassing, what blood and sorrow, what good ships scuttled on the deep, what brave men walking the plank blindfold, what shot of cannon, what shame and lies and cruelty, perhaps no man alive could tell. Yet there were still 3 upon that island, Silver and old Morgan and Ben Gunn, who had each taken his share in these crimes, as each yet hoped in vain to share in the reward. "Come in, Jim," said the captain. "You're a good boy in your line, Jim, but I don't think you and me'll go to sea again. You're too much of the born favourite for me. Is that you, John Silver? What brings you here, man?" "Come back to my duty, sir," returned Silver. "Oh," said the captain, and that was all he said. What a supper I had of it that night, with all my friends around me, and what a meal it was, with Ben Gunn's salted goat, and some delicacies, and a bottle of old wine from the Hispaniola. Never, I am sure, were people gayer or happier. And there was Silver, sitting back almost out of the firelight, but eating heartily, prompt to spring forward when anything was wanted, even joining quietly in our laughter, the same bland, obsequious seaman of the voyage out. End of Chapter 33. Chapter 34. And last. The next morning we fell early to work, for the transportation of this great mass of gold near a mile by land to the beach, and thence 3 miles by boat to the Hispaniola, was a considerable task for so small a number of workmen. The 3 fellows still abroad upon the island did not greatly trouble us. A single sentry on the shoulder of the hill was sufficient to ensure us against any sudden onslaught, and we thought, besides, They had had more than enough of fighting. Therefore the work was pushed on briskly. Gray and Ben Gunn came and went with the boat, while the rest, during their absences, piled treasure on the beach. Two of the bars, slung in a rope's end, made a good load for a grown man, one that he was glad to walk slowly with. For my part, I was not so much use at carrying. I was kept busy all day in the cave, packing the minted money into bread bags. It was a strange collection, like Billy Bones' hoard for the diversity of coinage, but so much larger and so much more varied that I think I never had more pleasure than in sorting them. English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Georges and Louises, doubloons and double guineas and mois d'ors and sequins and pictures of all the kings of Europe for the last 100 years, strange oriental pieces stamped with what looked like wisps of string or bits of spider's web, round pieces and square pieces, and pieces bored through the middle as if to wear them round your neck. Nearly every variety of money in the world must, I think, have found a place in that collection, and for number I am sure they were like autumn leaves, so that my back ached with stooping and my fingers with sorting them out. Day after day this work went on. By every evening a fortune had been stowed aboard, but there was another fortune waiting for the morrow. And all this time we heard nothing of the 3 surviving mutineers. At last, I think it was on the 3rd night, the doctor and I were strolling on the shoulder of the hill where it overlooks the lowlands of the isle, when, from out of the thick darkness below, the wind brought us a noise between shrieking and singing. It was only a snatch that reached our ears, followed by the former silence.
"Heaven forgive them," said the doctor. "'Tis the mutineers."
"All drunk, sir," struck in the voice of Silver from behind us. Silver, I should say, was allowed his entire liberty, and in spite of daily rebuffs seemed to regard himself once more as quite a privileged and friendly dependent. Indeed, it was remarkable how well he bore these slights, and with what unwearying politeness he kept at trying to ingratiate himself with all. Yet I think none treated him better than a dog, unless it was Ben Gunn, who was still terribly afraid of his old quartermaster, or myself, who had really something to thank him for, although for that matter I suppose I had reason to think even worse of him than anybody else, for I had seen him meditating a fresh treachery upon the plateau. Accordingly, it was pretty gruffly that the doctor answered him.
"Drunk or raving?"
said he.
"Right you were, sir," replied Silver, "and precious little odds which to you and me." "I suppose you would hardly ask me to call you a humane man," returned the doctor with a sneer, "and so my feelings may surprise you, Master Silver. But if I was sure they were raving, as I am morally certain one at least of them is down with fever, I should leave this cam band at whatever risk to my own carcass, take them the assistance of my skill." "Ask your pardon, sir, you would be very wrong," quoth Silver. "You would lose your precious life, and you may lay to that. I'm on your side now, hand and glove, and I shouldn't wish for to see the party weakened, let alone yourself, seeing as I know what I owes you. But these men down there, they couldn't keep their word, no, not supposing they wished to, and what's more, they couldn't believe as you could." "No," said the doctor. "You're the man to keep your word, we know that."
Well, that was about the last news we had of the 3 pirates. Only once we heard a gunshot a great way off, and supposed them to be hunting. A council was held, and it was decided that we must desert them on the island, to the huge glee, I must say, of Ben Gunn, and with the strong approval of Gray. We left a good stock of powder and shot, the bulk of the salt goat, a few medicines and some other necessities, tools, clothing, a spare sail, a fathom or 2 of rope, and, by the particular desire of the doctor, a handsome present of tobacco. That was about our last doing on the island. Before that we had got the treasure stowed, and had shipped enough water and the remainder of the goat meat in case of any distress. And at last, one fine morning, we weighed anchor, which was about all that we could manage, and stood out of North Inlet, the same colours flying that the captain had flown and fought under at the palisade. The three fellows must have been watching us closer than we thought, as we soon had proved, for, coming through the Narrows, we had to lie very near the southern point, and there we saw all three of them kneeling together on a spit of sand with their arms raised in supplication. It went to all our hearts, I think, to leave them in that wretched state, but we could not risk another mutiny, and to take them home for the gibbet would have been a cruel sort of kindness. The doctor hailed them and told them of the stores we had left, and where they were to find them. But they continued to call us by name, and appeal to us for God's sake to be merciful, and not to leave them to die in such a place. At last, seeing the ship still bore on her course, and was now swiftly drawing out of earshot, one of them, I know not which it was, leapt to his feet with a hoarse cry, whipped his musket to his shoulder, and sent a shot whistling over Silver's head and through the mainsail. After that we kept under cover of the bulwarks, and when next I looked out they had disappeared from the spit, and the spit itself had almost melted out of sight in the growing distance. That was at least the end of that. And before noon, to my inexpressible joy, the highest rock of Treasure Island had sunk into the blue round of sea. We were so short of men that everyone on board had to bear a hand, only the captain lying on a mattress in the stern and giving his orders, for though greatly recovered he was still in want of quiet. We laid her head for the nearest port in South America, for we could not risk the voyage home without fresh hands. And as it was, what with baffling winds and a couple of fresh gales, we were all worn out before we reached it. It was almost sundown when we cast anchor in a most beautiful landlocked gulf, and were almost immediately surrounded by shore boats full of negroes and Mexican Indians and half-bloods, selling fruits and vegetables, and offering to dive for bits of money. The sight of so many good-humoured faces, especially the blacks, the taste of the tropical fruits, and above all the lights that began to shine in the town, made a most charming contrast to our dark and bloody sojourn on the island. And the doctor and the squire, taking me along with them, went ashore to pass the early part of the night. Here they met the captain of an English man-of-war, fell in talk with him, went on board his ship, and, in short, had so agreeable a time that day was breaking when we came alongside the Hispaniola. Ben Gunn was on deck alone, and as soon as we came on board he began, with wonderful contortions, to make us a confession. Silver was gone. The Maroon had connived at his escape in a shore boat some hours ago, and he now assured us that he had only done so to preserve our lives, which would certainly have been forfeited if "that man with the one leg had stayed aboard." But this was not all. The sea cook had not gone empty-handed. He had cut through a bulwark unobserved, and had removed one of the sacks of coin, worth perhaps 300 or 400 guineas, to help him on his further wanderings. I think we were all pleased to be so cheaply quit of him. Well, to make a long story short, we got a few hands on board, made a good cruise home, and the Hispaniola reached Bristol just as Mr. Blandy was beginning to think of fitting out her consort. 5 men only of those who sailed returned with her. Drink and the devil had done for the rest with a vengeance, although, to be sure, we were not quite in so bad a case as that other ship they sung about, with 1 man of the crew alive, what put to sea with 75. All of us had an ample share of the treasure, and used it wisely or foolishly according to our natures. Captain Smollett is now retired from the sea. Gray not only saved his money, but, being suddenly smit with the desire to rise, also studied his profession, and he is now mate and part owner of a fine full-rigged ship, married besides, and the father of a family. As for Ben Gunn, he got £1,000, which he spent or lost in 3 weeks, or, to be more exact, in 19 days, for he was back begging on the 20th. Then he was given a lodge to keep, exactly as he'd feared upon the island, and he still lives a great favourite, though something of a butt with the country boys, and a notable singer in church on Sundays and saints' days. Of Silver we have heard no more. That formidable seafaring man with one leg has, at last, gone clean out of my life, but I dare say he met his old negress, and perhaps still lives in comfort with her and Captain Flint. It is to be hoped so, I suppose, for his chances of comfort in another world are very small. The bar silver and arms still lie, for all that I know, where Flint buried them, and certainly they shall lie there for me. Oxen and wain ropes would not bring me back to that accursed island, and the worst dreams that ever I have are when I hear the surf booming about its coasts, or starting up in bed with the sharp voice of Captain Flint still ringing in my ears. "Pieces of 8? Pieces of 8?" End of Chapter 33 and end of Treasure Island.
50 men on the dead man's chest. Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Drink and the devil have done for and a bottle of
Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum.
Oh my gosh. I know. Oh my gosh. There's so much. And it's all wonderful. I'm going to go back to the beginning of today's chapters. I loved Long John Silver's thinking through the something's weird about this voice. And I know I'm around a bunch of superstitious boobs, but I know that something else is going on. He has to think his way through it, but he also has to think his way through it out loud in a way that's going to convince the superstitious pirates to go along with him. And all sorts of Monty Python bells were going off in my mind. His whole little speech about the echo. I've never seen a ghost with a shadow. I've never seen a spirit with a shadow, so they wouldn't have an echo either, but I heard an echo. Made me think of, what else floats? Small bits of wood. And oh my gosh, I couldn't stop giggling, so I had to stop listening for a little while and then go back to it later. So, she's a witch. Burn her. There's a punctuation joke that you couldn't see. After the guys calm down, after Silver has put their minds at ease, the line was, and soon they were chatting together, comma, with intervals of listening, semicolon, and not long after, and then it goes on into the rest of the sentence. But it's like they were chatting, and this is important, and they listened to each other for a little while also, which was evidently a big deal for them. And that's Jim's adult commentary on the pirates, which I thought was kind of fun. So the pirates get over their fright. They follow the map. They get to the tree. Interesting description of the tree. And it's a big excavation pit. And there's no there. Were you surprised? I listened to this so long ago, I actually don't remember whether I was surprised or not. I do remember that what surprised me was the same thing that both surprised and had already stopped surprising Jim, was how quickly Silver changed sides and how completely he changed sides. He is a much more interesting character than I had ever expected, and I know I've said that to you before, but I hope that you found him as fascinating a portrait as I did. And it isn't a surprise, or at least it wasn't a surprise to me, that Silver was created by the guy who did Jekyll and Hyde. It also surprises me that it was also the guy who did A Child's Garden of Verses. That seems awfully incongruous to me, but Stevenson seems to have been a restless spirit, not just physically in that he traveled a lot, but also in his, in his attention. It's like he's an ADD writer. that if he spends too long in one genre or topic or area, anything other than the ocean, which he does keep going back to over and over again, both in essays and in stories, he is kind of like a pachinko ball bouncing off of whatever interests him at that time and writes about that for a while and then switches. So, okay, I brought ADD back. But the Silver's ability to treat his inner morality like a movable feast, where he can just pick himself up 100% and move over to the other side and totally buy it. He's selling it. He buys it himself. He is gung-ho. And the proof to me of his real ability to do that is how long they had to spend on the ship with him being the cook. And yes, I know there were pirates on board as well who he was friends with. And so he had his moments, like Jim witnessed when he was in the apple barrel, that Silver had these moments where he was able to be his own true, and I'm using air quotes around that, true self. That may be true, but it seems like that's as much a part as anything else. He's so much smarter than the rest of the pirates. So it had to be hard for him, intellectually speaking, to be so much closer to Livesey. I mean, they probably could have sat down and had a really interesting conversation about neurobiochemistry. Okay, so they probably could have actually sat down and had a really interesting conversation about just about anything. Politics, economics, finance, the importance of saving for a rainy day, you name it. I'll bet they could have waxed rhapsodic with each other. Trelawney would have sat there taking pot shots at them for being nerds, but I can really see the two of them doing that. And Stevenson says as much several times in the book, that but for other circumstances, Silver would have been a different guy, class-wise, not different guy internally. I don't know what made him like that. We don't get a backstory. He doesn't need one. He's better without one. So yeah, I like Silver. I can't remember if I was surprised by the gold all being gone, but I know I was surprised by the fact that Livesey and the other guys started shooting pirates. And clearly, they were very specific in who they were shooting. They got rid of some of the more dangerous ones first. They weren't shooting at all near Silver. And Silver was very smart to keep Jim by him. He knows Jim is his ticket to ride. So if there's no Jim, there won't be a Silver for very long. I remember I wasn't surprised by that part. I was impressed with how fast they beat it out of there. And I was not surprised by the pirates not running after them. and then that's kind of it, right? I mean, then it's just load up the gold, get out of Dodge. You see the three guys standing on the shore, first waving like, don't leave us, and then taking pot shots at the Hispaniola because they're ticked. Whether they ever could hear Livesey saying, hey, we left you food and stuff, who knows? They're probably going to wind up killing each other before malaria gets them anyway. So yeah, those guys don't seem as clever as Ben Gunn. Of course, Ben Gunn didn't seem all that clever to anybody either. So what do I know about that? But they get up, they get out. Smollett said something to Jim that I thought was interesting. He said, I don't think we'll sail together again. You're a bit of a born favorite. And I thought about that for a while, and I talked to a couple people, and we kind of worked it out as you've been lucky during your life. I mean, your father dying notwithstanding, you've been lucky, and you kind of a little spoiled, and you don't really know how to do your duty and stick to your orders. And I can't have that on my ship. I like you. I just can't have that on my ship, which I thought was absolutely perfectly Smollett. I also thought that Jim's commentary about how he and everybody else responded when they came back to the Hispaniola and Ben Gunn explained that Long John Silver, much like Jim's mother, had taken the gold he was quote unquote owed and no more, which again, that one surprised me. He took his share and ran. And Jim's comment was, we were pleased to be so cheaply quit of him. Wow, we got rid of him and that was it? That's all he took? Well, hot diggity, because he could have killed them all. He could have picked one of them to hold for ransom until they gave him all the gold that he could carry. And no, he wanted what he was owed. He was going to be fair and square about it. And then he took off. And probably is living happily ever after somewhere with his wife, and probably bought another pub to run somewhere. And he'll probably live to be quite old, and he'll have great stories to tell, as does, obviously, Jim. Now, the Ben Gunn thing, what was I talking about? Ben Gunn spent all of his money in, 19 days, and on the 20th day, he came back to ask for more. So they put him up, and somehow I had thought it was on Squire Trelawney's property, but I don't think it actually says that in the book. I just imagined that he'd been given a lodge to keep, which was the thing he had said he feared. And that was the line that I kept going, wait a minute, a lodge? Why does he not want, this as being like either, it could have been a couple different things. He could have been a gatekeeper, or he could have been working in a hunting lodge where it's on the grounds of a manor of an estate, and he may not have to wear livery because he's not serving at table, but he probably has some kind of a uniform-ish. And especially if he's manning the gate, the front gate to the house, he would be wearing something like a uniform. But that was the line, part of the line that I read to you was, do you think he's going to be liberal-minded? I don't mean giving me a gate to keep and a suit of livery clothes and such. That's not my mark. And yet, when it came right down to it, that was the only thing he could manage to do, because he just didn't know how to handle the cash, is what it was. And Jim, did Jim surprise you at the end? He is so done with treasure hunting. He is so done with adventuring. He hears that pieces of eight in his mind, and he's horrified. And he saw a lot of really horrible things. It's true. I thought it was really interesting that Stevenson decided not to make him wistful about the danger and the drama and all of that. But no, he's actually talking like an adult. No, this was a horrifying thing for a kid to go through, period. We got out, we got some great stories about it, yay. But done, I like that. I like that a lot. So I thought, before I let you go, that I would read you the review of Treasure Island, written by G.K. Chesterton. I will not sound like either G.K. Chesterton or Neil Gaiman as I read this to you, but I did want to read this to you. All things and all men are underrated, much by others, especially by themselves, and men grow tired of men just as they do of green grass, so that they have to seek for green carnations. All great men possess in themselves the qualities which will certainly lay them open to censure and diminishment. But these inevitable deficiencies in the greatness of great men vary in the widest degree of variety. Stevenson is open to a particularly subtle, a particularly unjust disparagement. The advantage of great men like Blake or Browning or Walt Whitman is that they did not observe the niceties of technical literature. The far greater disadvantage is that he, Stevenson, did. Because he had a conscience about small matters in art, he is conceived not to have had an imagination about big ones. It is assumed by some that he must have been a bad architect, and the only reason that they can assign is that he was a good workman. The mistake which has given rise to this conception is one that has much to answer for in numerous departments of modern art, literature, religion, philosophy, and politics. The supreme and splendid characteristic of Stevenson was his levity, and his levity was the flower of 100 grave philosophies. A swift, humane levity is the mark of spiritual strength. A thoroughly strong man swinging a sledgehammer can tap the top of an eggshell. A weaker man swinging a sledgehammer will break the table on which it stands into pieces. Also, if he's a very weak man, he'll be proud of having broken the table and call himself a strong man, dowered with the destructive power of an imperial race. ... In the case of so light and elusive a figure as Stevenson, even the terms which have been most definitely attached to him tend to become misleading and inadequate, and the terms childlike or childish, true as they are down to a very fundamental truth, are yet the origin of a certain confusion. One of the greatest errors in existing literary philosophy is that of confusing the child with the boy. Many great moral teachers, beginning with Jesus Christ, have perceived the profound philosophical importance of the child. The child sees everything freshly and fully. As we advance in life, it is true that we see things in some degree less and less, that we are afflicted, spiritually and morally, with the myopia of the student. But the problem of the boy is essentially different from that of the child. The boy represents the earliest growth of the earthly, unmanageable qualities, poetic still, but not so simple or so universal. The child enjoys the plain picture of the world. The boy wants the secret, the end of the story. The child wishes to dance in the sun, but the boy wishes to sail after buried treasure. The child enjoys a flower, and the boy a mechanical engine. And the finest and most peculiar work of Stevenson is rather that he was the first writer to treat seriously and poetically the aesthetic instincts of the boy. He celebrated the toy gun rather than the rattle. In the whole scene, there is only one book which is at once literature, like Hans Andersen, and yet a book for boys and not for children. And its name is Treasure Island, 1902. Oh, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the book. I hope you enjoyed all of this crazy. I thank you so much for being patient with me these last many weeks. And in the new year, I am planning to start a new book. And I think I am finally going to tackle, this has been a request since, oh my goodness, since the first time I ever did a live anything where I was meeting Craftlit listeners in public for real. One of you, and I know I wrote it down at the time, and I've actually been looking for this note and I couldn't find it, came up to me and said, you know, the book that you really must do, because no one else does it, and it is very, very worthy of being done, is one of the Bronte's books that doesn't get read very often, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. This has stuck with me all of these years, and I've toyed with doing it before and since, and for one reason or another, it just never worked out. Because I'm taking time off for both the holidays and getting Aaron back into his second semester of his sophomore year, I have more time to prepare for it, and that means it'll be coming out. So Tenant of Wildfell Hall is going to be the next one. I have no idea whether I am going to find audio that I like or if I'm going to need somebody to read. So if you're interested in reading, let me know. If you know of an excellent recording that I can get a hold of, that is also public domain, let me know. If you have comments to share, area code 206-350-1642. If we get a bunch of comments after this episode is released, Justin and I will figure something out and compile a whole short on what y'all have to say. So don't hesitate if you have things you need to say about the show, the book. Don't hold back. It's all worth it. 206-350-1642. All right, I'm out of here. I'm going to go get dinner and get working on The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. All right. Have a great one. Have a great holiday. Have a very happy new year. And I'll see you on the flip side. Bye. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review at iTunes or like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter or any one of a million different places that Craftlit wound up over the last 13 years. For more information on Craftlit, you can visit craftlit.com and subscribe via your favorite podcast app or download the Craftlit app so you can get all of your episodes right there in your hand, all in one place without having to hassle with anything else. So you can be sure not to miss any of Treasure Island. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on. Thanks.